Hello, my name is Euro and welcome to another Baldur's Gate 3 build video. In today's video, I'll show you my Sebille build, which is the another Divinity Original Sin inspired character build. This is also the last one we'll do because this is the last origin character that we have from that game. Now, Sebille is, when you meet her in the original game, is a rogue, so this is perfect because we're going to be multi-classing her with a rogue and a fighter, so we can dual wield 2 daggers. Now, generally in Divinity Original Sin, you want your rogues there to have daggers so that they can do backstabs and so on. Now, the backstabbing doesn't really work here in this game like it does there. Here, we basically have a sneak attack, while in Divinity Original Sin, if you attack an enemy from behind, you can get a backstab critical, which deals more damage. So here, we kind of can translate that with the sneak attack, although it works only once per turn. So let's get into character creation. So for race, of course, we're going as an elf, as Sebille is an elf. This gives us the Fey Ancestry, which gives us advantage on against saving throws when being charmed. And we also can't be put to sleep by magic, which is quite nice. We get Dark Vision, and also we get Elven Weapon Training. Now, this won't matter too much because we're going to be multi-classing with a fighter, and that's going to give us basically all of our required proficiencies. For the subrace, we're going as a Wood Elf. I think Wood Elf is quite fitting, as elves in Divinity Original Sin are very Wood Elf-like. They're all about forest, trees, and revolving around that, so Wood Elves are quite, I would say, translate quite well. Wood Elves now do get the Fleet of Foot, which gives us increased movement speed of 5 feet, so technically Wood Elves have the longest reach with their movement, which is quite nice. For our first level, we're going as a Rogue. We're going to start as a Rogue, and then later on we're going to get to a fighter, so we will have 3 attacks regardless, because we're going to be dual wielding, but instead of having 3 attacks with extra attack, we'll have 3 attacks first with a offhand and our main hand attacks. For our background, we're going as a criminal. Now, Sebille in the game is a outlaw or a scholar. Now, we have backgrounds that translate into that relatively well. So, criminal is the translation of the outlaw, and then scholar will be sage. I decided to go as a criminal because I thought it would be more fitting. Although you can go with a sage as well. It's completely up to you, or you can just pick up your own favorite background. It's not too much of a big deal. For ability scores, we're going with 17 dexterity, 16 constitution, 14 wisdom, and 10 strength. 10 strength is mainly here to help us a little bit with our carry weight. Then 17 dexterity is here to primarily be our main combat stat. Also, it's going to help us with armor class and primarily with our initiative, because we want to be first, as of course we are trying to be this assassin type character. For Constitution 16, this is mainly here to help us with health. We won't be casting any spells, but mainly we want relatively high HP. And then lastly, Wisdom 14 to help us a little bit with the Wisdom saving throws, such as against hold person and similar spells. Now for our skills, from our background we got Deception and Stealth, which is okay. This weakness Stealth we can utilize, but we don't necessarily need to. And Deception is decent in the dialogue situations. We gain Perception from our race, which is actually quite nice because Perception is very important. And then for our expertise skills, now if you don't have any other sleight of hand character, you can have Sebille here be your main sleight of hand character. But the second point of expertise, I would highly suggest putting into Perception, because Perception is very important, because it is probably the most common skill you will have to use in the game outside of dialogue skills, right? The Perception is the one that you will use the most to spot invisible levers, buttons, and so on. Then for our other skills, so we would have 3 points. So if we remove Insight and Persuasion, you could, since we already have Deception, we could put 1 into Persuasion so that we are covered in that remark, because sometimes Deception won't pop up. Persuasion is probably the most common one out of the dialogue ones. You could do that, although it's probably not necessary. Instead, I think Insight is very important, and Investigation. They pop up quite a lot, and they can help you with Insight. For example, one example I can remember is Zarel. If you basically pass an Insight check, you can see that she is distressed, and you can ask additional support from her, so that then the Bugbear Merchant will unlock additional special items. So this is one example, for example, where this can be very handy. Then for the last point, you could put Athletics or Acrobatics, or again, one of the dialogue ones. I will just put it into Athletics so that I have a point there. But again, a good choice I think would be Persuasion. Alright, so at level 2 we gain our cunning actions, hide, dash, and disengage, and we can move on to level 3. At level 3 we unlock our subclass, and here we're gonna go with the Thief subclass. Reason is, of course, we get the second bonus action. This is gonna be great because eventually we'll be able to attack 4 times per turn with our weapons. Since we get 2 main hand attacks and 2 offhand attacks, we also get this second story work, which halves the damage we take from falling damage, which is okay. It's nothing too great, but it's nice to have, especially if you're trying to jump somewhere and you can then reduce the damage you take. At level 4 we get our first feat, and here we're going to go with ability improvement +2 into dexterity. This is going to increase our combat prowess, our armor class, and initiative, which is what we want. Also at this point on level 4 you could deal with anti-ethel to get a +1 into dexterity, running it up to a nice 20. And then finally in Act 2 you can go to the Mirror of Loss and there get potentially another 2 dexterity, which would be a total of 22 dexterity, which is the end game goal we want to have for this character. At level 5 we're going to start our multi-class for Fighter, and here we're going to be sticking with the Fighter for the rest of the game because we want to get our 4 feats, which is going to be quite helpful for us. As a fighter, we gain our second wind, so this is a 1 to 10 heal plus our fighter level. It's nothing too amazing, but it can come in handy when you want to heal, or if you have a bonus action for free. Then for our fighting style, we're going to go with 2-weapon fighting. What this does is basically when we make an attack with our offhand weapon, we add our ability modifier to the damage of the attack. So basically now our main hand and offhand attacks are comparable. They take into consideration our dexterity modifier and so on. At level 6, we unlock our fighter action surge and we can move on to level 7. At level 7, we unlock our fighter subclass, and here we're going to go with champion. The reason we're going with champion is it's going to give us the improved critical hit, so we need to roll we need to get the one roll less to get a critical hit, so we crit on a 19, and we're going to be stacking a little bit of critical hit chance with this character with some of our equipment, so it's going to be quite helpful for us with this as well. At level 8, we unlock our second feat, and here we're gonna go with Savage Attacker. So what Savage Attacker does is gonna make us, when we make melee weapon attacks, we roll our damage dice twice and we use the highest result. So basically, we're gonna be increasing our damage on average, which is pretty good for generally a lot of the melee characters that aren't using Great Weapon Master, for example. At level fight to level 5, level 9, we unlock our second attack. So now we basically can attack 4 times per turn, which is quite helpful. At level 10, we unlock our third feat, and here you can go either with Alert, or what I went with here is the Sentinel. Now the reason we're going to go with Sentinel is this is going to increase our potential damage output in the end turn, so when we are just waiting for our turn again. And we usually will want to stand next to our allies, because what Sentinel does is when an enemy within melee range attacks an ally, you can use a reaction to make a weapon attack against that enemy. That target ally must not have Sentinel feat. So if we have dual wielding, we can potentially then do 2 attacks against them, because dual wielding sometimes triggers both attacks unless you disable it manually with there's a hotkey for it, and / there's a button on the UI. We also get advantage on opportunity attacks, and when you crit a creature with opportunity attack, it can no longer move for the rest of its turn, so we can anchor down enemies maybe trying to run away from us or trying to run through us to our allies, which is quite helpful. At level 11, we unlock the Remarkable Add Proficiency, so we add our half our proficiency bonus to any strength, dexterity, and constitution saving throw check, or constitution check that we are not proficient in. We also get Remarkable Athlete Jump, so our jumping distance is increased by 10 feet. Now this is a lot better, for example, on high strength characters, but it's still pretty good even though we have relatively low strength. And then finally at level 12, we unlock our 4th and last feat, and here we're going with Alert. I think Alert is very fitting for Sebille, especially because when you consider her in Divinity Original Sin, she is an assassin type character, so she shouldn't really get surprised. She shouldn't get surprised by that many things or anything at all, right? So I think this is a very fitting feat for her. Alright, so that's it for the levels. I'm gonna see you in the equipment section. Alright, so here we are in the equipment section. So let's start with our headgear. Here we have the Covert Cowl. Obscure, the number into roll critical hit while attacking is reduced by 1. This effect can stack. So we're gonna be stacking with this with a little bit of our fire subclass. So now we're gonna be critting on a 18 instead of a 20 or a 19, which is gonna be quite helpful, especially with some of our equipment. For the early game alternative, you could use the Haste Helm. This gives you momentum for 3 turns, and each stack of momentum gives you 5 feet of extra movement. This is a pretty good helmet for maneuverability, but other than that, you would be replacing it relatively quickly. For the cloak, I went with the Cloak of Displacement. At the beginning of the wearer's turn, the cloak activates, granting enemies disadvantage on attack rolls that target the wearer. This effect lasts until the wearer takes damage. So basically, it gives you the effects of Blur, which is pretty good as a defensive cloak since enemies have disadvantage. Alternatively, you could use the Cloak of Cutting Broom. When the wearer disengages, they create a fog cloud with 7 feet radius that lasts for 1 turn. You can basically blind enemies that are standing next to you for a bonus action, since we are, of course, a rogue. So it's a pretty decent cloak for rogues there. Then for the armor, we're going with the ballast armor. Enemies within 10 feet become vulnerable to piercing unless they're resistant or immune to it. If they're resistant to the piercing damage, you then strip them of resistance, so they, regardless if they're resistant or not, they will take full or double damage. If they're immune, then of course they're immune, but there are not too many enemies that are immune to the piercing damage effect. There are a lot of who are resistant to it though. And we also get +2 bonus to initiative, which is pretty good. So this is a pretty good armor for this character, because of course daggers, since we're focusing on using daggers are relatively weak because they're only a 1d4. This is going to help us deal quite a lot of damage with them, of course. Then for the alternatives, we can use the Shade Clinger armor. While obscured, the wearer has advantage on saving throws and stealth +1. This is a great piece of armor, even if you're somebody who is, for example, a caster and you have proficiency in light armor. You could use this to gain advantage on saving throws basically for free. Or all you have to make sure is that you're standing in a dark, slightly or very dark area. I forgot the exact in-game term, but I hope you know what I mean. For the other alternatives, you could use the Adamantine Scale Mail, which decreases incoming damage by 1. It also applies reeling for 2 turns when enemy hits you in melee, so then they have less of a chance of hitting you again. And we also get immunity to critical hits, so we don't take full damage when a critical hits. Then lastly, we have the UNT Scale Mail. Add your full dexterity modifier to your armor class. Also, this armor does not impose disadvantage on stealth checks, and we gain a +1 bonus to initiative, so this is a pretty decent armor to have as well. For the gloves, we have the Crater Flesh gloves. Whenever you score a critical hit, you deal additional 1d6 force damage. Now, there's ways of increasing this, because on its own, this is not too amazing, but some of the items can increase this to 7 plus 1d6 force damage. So we'll get into that when we get to our weapons. But these gloves are going to be pretty amazing for dealing ridiculous amounts of damage once we actually do crit an enemy. For the alternatives, we have the Dark Justiciar gauntlets, which deal extra 1d4 necrotic damage with our weapons, so a pretty good damage increasing gloves there. Same with the Flood Heldas gloves, which increase our damage by 1d4 fire damage. The other effect is for if you are unarmed, so we don't really care about that. For the boots, we're going with the Disintegrating Nightwalkers. We can't be webbed, entangled, and snared, or we can slip or grease on ice, and we gain Misty Step once per short rest, so pretty amazing piece of boots there, especially because of the great mobility that we get from Misty Step. For the amulet, we're going with the Surgeon's Subjugation amulet. Once per long rest while scoring critical hit on a humanoid, the wearer can paralyze the target for 2 turns. This is actually a pretty good and a relatively crucial piece of equipment for this character, because we'll be critting relatively often, and the paralyze for 2 turns is guaranteed, so there is no saving throw against it. So humanoid bosses and so powerful enemies will have a hard time fighting us, because of course they'll be paralyzed for 2 turns, and then we deal ridiculous amounts of critical strike damage, which of course paralyze enables if you're attacking within 10 feet. For the alternatives, we have the Face Amulet's amulet. We have advantage on intelligence, wisdom, and charisma saving throws. A pretty good defensive amulet. You could also replace this for the amulet of the Harpers. It has the same effect of advantage on wisdom saving throws, but instead of intelligence, charisma, it gives you 1 shield spell per long rest. So you could use either one of those. Then we have the Broodmother's Revenge. Whenever the wearer is healed, their weapon becomes coated in magic and deals additional 1d6 poison damage. So a pretty decent one there to increase your damage. And then we have lastly the Amulet of Branding. This is going to be basically a pseudo replacement for our ballast armor until we get it, or until we get some of the better amulets. Basically what it does, it allows us to choose an enemy and then choose if if we want them to be vulnerable to bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing. Now, okay, our case, we would want them to be vulnerable to piercing, and same thing, if they're resistant to piercing, it strips them of that resistance. Although the sad part is this lasts for 3 turns, but if the target takes damage, this effect dissipates, so it disappears. So hopefully you don't waste it. You would want to use this on a target you can sneak attack, so then you hopefully crit and you deal ridiculous damage with that. Then for our rings, we have the Ring of Free Action. You ignore the effects of difficult terrain, you can be paralyzed or restrained. So this ring synergizes greatly with our boots, because our boots prevent us from slipping, and this ring prevents us from being slowed by difficult terrain, paralyzed, or restrained. So we are really hard to shut down or crowd control, right? Unless an enemy manages to stun us or something like that. Then for the second ring, we have the Shadow Cloak ring. The wearer's weapon is an unarmed attacks the additional 1d4 damage against slightly or heavily obscured targets. That's the word I was looking for, obscured. And creatures made of shadow. Then the alternative that you could use is the Acoustic Band. Your weapon attacks deal 2 acid damage extra, so you can use Acoustic Band or the Shadow Cloak ring in basically either one, or what's your preference. Then for our weapons, I went with, of course, the Needle of the Outlaw Rogue. Now, this is the dagger that is actually tied to Sebille. It is in the DLC that comes with Baldur's Gate if you buy it. That DLC is basically cosmetic because it is basically references to the characters from Divinity Original Sin, and this is one of those items. And basically, it's just a standard 1d4 damage dagger. It's not enhanced or anything, so which is unfortunate. I was hoping these would possibly be able to get in the late game or something like that, unlock some sort of, at least enchantment +1, but unfortunately it's not. I've been running it in this, and it is a subpar to a lot of the other weapons, namely because it's not enchanted. So if you do end up running this the entire game, you would kind of need to run the diluted oil of sharpness, which basically gives a weapon enchantment +1, so it can overcome resistances to non-magical damage. Otherwise, what I would suggest you to use is the Doloramaro's dagger and then dual wield this. Reason is Doloramaro's daggers, each one has the ability, when you run a critical hit with a weapon or unarmed attack, it deals additional 7 damage, and it's enchantment +2, which is pretty nice. So what this 7 damage does, since we have 2 of them, when we crit, we're gonna deal additional 14 piercing damage. But what happens also if we crit, that 7 damage applies to the gloves as well. So then we get 14 plus 1d6 force damage, which is quite ridiculous with how much damage that then can end up being whenever you crit, right? Now, there are 2 of these daggers. First dagger you can find on the Red Dwarf. He's basically the one that rolls around with a bunch of the shapeshifters. And then the second dagger you can buy from the Ballist Merchant when you become an Unholy Assassin. But personally, I've been running with this just for the sake of it. Of course, you kind of do hinder yourself with this, but it's doable. It's nothing too serious, right? So the other alternatives, and we have quite a lot of dagger alternatives. We have the Ritual Dagger. Basically, when you make a successful attack with the dagger, you gain a 1d4 bonus to attack rolls and saving throws until the end of your turn. Essentially, you apply Bless to yourself for 1 turn. If you want to get that Bless immediately, you can use a bonus action to deal 1d4 slashing damage to yourself to get that bonus immediately. Then you could use the Hunter's Dagger, which on a successful hit, enemy must succeed a DC 13 Constitution saving throw, or they become Ruptured for 3 turns, I believe. And what Rupture does is they take 1d4 piercing damage every time they move, so they can take a little bit of extra damage with that. Then we have the Ritual Dagger of Sharp. That is actually a quite decent dagger because it has a 1d4 additional necrotic damage, so it has slightly higher damage than some other daggers do. Then we have the Gleam Dance Dagger. This object glowing, so it has a light radius of 20 feet around it. It's enchantment +2, and it also gives you +1 to armor class when you wield it in your offhand. So that's pretty good if you want extra armor class. Then we have the Cold Snap. Now this dagger does deal 1d4 extra cold damage, and when it's in an offhand, whenever the creature misses you with an attack, it must succeed a DC 13 Constitution saving throw or become chilled for 2 turns. Shield is basically they're vulnerable to cold damage and resistant to fire damage. It doesn't matter too much for us because we don't deal that much cold damage if we do wield this, and we gain armor class +1. Although keep in mind, this dagger, even though you get it in Act 3, is actually not enchanted, so it doesn't have enchantment +1, so do keep that in mind. Then we also have the Dread Iron Dagger. You find this with the Ballist Merchant as well. While its wielder is hidden, it deals extra 1d6 necrotic damage. Now, this is not too useful because this would only work on the first attack or if you go hiding again, but since we're dual wielding, we might as well attack 4 times instead of 2 times, and then each time we hide, right? So it's not too great of a dagger. Then we have also the Murderous Cut. This is also a pretty good dagger because when this weapon deals additional 1d4 piercing damage against targets with 50% of their HP or fewer. So it essentially doubles its damage that it can do when enemy is low health. Then we have the Doloramaro's, and lastly we have the Susur Dagger. You could use this to silence targets on hits. This is an early game item, of course. You would probably replace it relatively early, but it's here because it's a relatively nice dagger to have as well. For our ranged weapons, we're going with the Dead Shot. The number you need to roll a critical hit where attacking is reduced by 1. This effect can stack, so we now have a -3 to our roll required for a critical hit, so we crit on a 17. It also doubles our proficiency while rolling a ranged attacks with this weapon unless we have a disadvantage, so it has much greater accuracy compared to all of the other ranged weapons, and on top of that it's an enchantment +2. For the alternatives, you could use the Bow of the Banshee, which when you on a hit you possibly inflict frightened on a target, and then you have 1d4 bonus to attack rolls and damage against frightened creatures. A pretty good bow that synergizes with frightened. You also have the least expected. While obscured in shadow, the wielder has 1d4 bonus to ranged weapon attacks, so we have greater accuracy while we are obscured. And on top of that, this has the blinding shot, which can potentially blind your target. And then we have the Hunter Shortbow. We would namely want this as a stat stick, so we have advantage against most Earth type enemies. And also it's useful to have the Hunter's Mark because that will increase our damage a little bit whenever we attack a target that is marked by it. And then lastly, we have the Gandra Aspirations here. Same reason, the advantage on most thirsty type enemies. And then finally, for some of the elixirs, we have the Elixir of Wishness. This would decrease our further required roll for a crit. So now with this active, we would critically hit on a 16, which is pretty good. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we would want to roll all of the diluted oil of sharpness for the enchantment +1 to our weapons. Although if you're running any of the other weapons that are enchanted, you won't necessarily need this unless you want the extra little bit of accuracy that it grants you. Alright, so that is it for the equipment. I'll now see you in the combat showcase. Alright, so here we are the Flaming Fists barracks for yet another battle showcase. Now, I did forget to drink an Elixir of Wishness before combat started, so we'll just do it right now. Hopefully it's not too much of a big deal. I did also get an unlimited power that lets me get a guaranteed critical hit once per long rest, just so that we can showcase the synergy with the Crater Flesh Gloves and our Dolor Amados daggers. Now, I did equip both of them, so now we should be dealing extra 17 damage when we crit with our offhand. Well, extra 14 plus 14, 20, 28 bonus damage. One will be piercing, one will be force. So let's take a look. So we activate this, so we crit. We one-shot that guy. Now we could also paralyze him, but since he's dead, it'll be wasted. But let's take a look at the damage. So we dealt 70 damage to him. So the dagger got doubled, 6. Then our enchantments, another +7, which is from the Shadow Thief. And then Dolor Amados 7 plus Dolor Amados 7. So we got 35 plus 35 from this, which is quite high. It's quite, it's pretty ridiculous. And then for offhand, if you take a look, which is the 1d6 force, which since it's a crit, it gets doubled. So technically, that the gloves don't actually say what they actually do. It should be 1d6, but because it's crit, it got doubled. So technically, it's a 2d6. But anyway, we got 11 from that, and then we got a +7 from the Dolor Amados for a total of 25. So yeah, it actually does work, and especially if you get the Vicious Shortbow, you could then have a +21 with that, which would be even more ridiculous. But then you would, of course, on average, crit less. Now let's see if we can get any more critical hits without the Luck of the Far Realms. We should be also... there we go, we managed to get a crit there. And then if we try to hit her... No crit, but still 28 damage, which is pretty good. It's especially nice because, of course, we double everything. But then here we go again. We got Dolor Amados triggering twice because we're dual wielding them, and same thing here. So it's essentially doubling the effect of Dolor Amados when you are using the Crater Flesh Gloves and you crit. Alright, but generally that is it for the build. I hope you enjoyed. I appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe for more Baldur's Gate 3 content, and I'll see you in the next one.